and I think it's the latter. So, yeah, I think, as a legal structure, like, how do we go back to the Nuremberg trials, as a legal precedent, and like, you didn't start with an individual that was guarding the individuals in these camps. You started with the top, and went your way down. What happened to that? Where is that law today? Why are we not starting at the top? Why are we not holding these individuals, these political officials, and these generals accountable? Are we pretending like they don't know what's actually going on? So, I don't know. That's my frustration with the situation. You're a 19-year-old kid. I don't know how old this person is. He was an E6, so he must have been a little bit older, maybe 20-some. Is the one that's being held accountable, and individuals have been like promoting and building this system and teaching people how to kill people and teaching people how to control and dominate situations and perpetuating this structure aren't being held accountable. But I think we should finish with the panel stuff. You guys wanted to bring up stuff, I know.
Well, I just wanted to respond to your question and say that in our society, there are a lot of mythologies that are used to discuss veteran and service members' experiences in war. And one of those mythologies, which Aaron just talked about, is that anytime there's a high-profile atrocity, which the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been full of, the mythology says that the problem is a few bad apples. So there are a few bad apple soldiers, and usually, according to this mythology, they're low-ranking, and we need to get rid of those bad apples. And that mythology is really damaging because it prevents us from looking at root causes in military structures. It prevents us from asking this question, does a 10-year war of occupation, 10 years and going, lead to these kinds of atrocities, and what are the root causes? And then another mythology is that the way you support the troops is by supporting the wars, and that the troops are overwhelmingly behind this. The last poll that measured how active duty service members felt about the war in Iraq was back in 2007. It was a Zogby poll that found that over 70% of soldiers, or of military service members in Iraq wanted an immediate withdrawal. That was back in 2007, and these kinds of studies aren't conducted very often. And then another problem with that mythology is that it makes it hard for service members to say that they're not okay, to say that they're hurt, to say that they've been raped, to say that they're traumatized. And there's also this mythology that a good soldier is someone who never speaks out and who never complains, and is someone who just gets hurt and then deals with it. So I guess just talking about veterans and our social understanding of what a veteran is in a post-9/11 era, I think it's really important for us to look at how our society talks about them and to really deconstruct that.
So maybe we can. So maybe we can talk about some of the more political efforts that either campaigns IVAW is involved with, or SimSol's involved with, or how these things tie into larger, I don't say larger, but other movements like the Occupy movement, or the labor movement, or the current election cycle.
I can talk some about Operation Recovery and sort of what that's looked like. Aaron's talked about the work down at Fort Hood, and so what Operation Recovery is doing is it's fighting for service members' right to heal. The right to, when someone survived a traumatic experience, the right to remove themselves from that traumatic experience. And for most people that have suffered from traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder, and often those two things are triggering each other, and the symptoms are very similar, that they are often sent back to war, whether that's on the same deployment, whether that's for a subsequent deployment. One example was someone named Jeff Hanks, who had previously deployed, was in Afghanistan, came home from leave, realized that he felt that he needed support, he needed help to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. When he went to the military to try to get that help, they wouldn't give it to him. And he ended up going AWOL in order to get help through civilian providers. And then he turned himself in to command, and they said that they would give him treatment and that he wasn't slated to deploy and they weren't sending him back. he might get what's called an Article 15 for going AWOL. And Article 15 is not a court-martial, but it's it's an administrative disciplinary procedure. And so he was getting treatment. Treatment was sometimes good, sometimes bad. It wasn't exactly what he wanted, but he wasn't getting deployed for about 2 months. And then they said 6 weeks of treatment had cured his post-traumatic stress disorder, and he should deploy to Afghanistan, and if he needed more help, he can get it in theater. So that's, like someone surviving a traumatic experience being sent back to the source of the trauma, and that would be the place to get the best help. And Sarah and I were actually down there with a few members of Iraq Veterans Against the War and a few other supporters to meet with him and other people in the area right when we got news that he was sent to deploy again. And so one of the things that we did was working with his attorney, who is a civilian attorney, we delivered an Article 138 to someone above his commander. And that's one of the strongest things that service members have as a sort of legal right, is this procedure where they can inform someone higher up in the chain of command that their direct commander has violated their rights somehow. And it's often not used. And one of the things, Aaron and Jacob can probably tell you about this, Dave, as well, the thing about the military is that not necessarily that you don't have any rights, like Aaron's saying, but that you don't know them. There's no way to have any knowledge that they exist. They don't teach you about them at the beginning of basic training. They don't tell you, hey, by the way, if after you're going through this you think you're a conscientious objector and totally hate all wars, this is how you can get out. You don't learn that in the initial process. Anyone that I've talked to, which is a couple dozen people who've gone through the conscientious objector process, found it out by talking to civilians, and it's a really that was really eye-opening to me to learn that people don't know these outlets that they have, these other opportunities. One of the other things that we were dealing with was someone who was set to deploy to Afghanistan, who was a sergeant. He had previously deployed to Iraq. He's an Iraq Veteran Against the War member, was really opposed to the war in Iraq and his experience there, and he was part of an Army Reserve unit that he felt was underprepared, that their equipment wasn't up to par, that their training wasn't sufficient, and he was speaking out about this. Thankfully he was able to work with some of us and other people to be able to help get his story out and help to let him and other people know that they have the right to share this information. Your First Amendment rights are not gone when you join the military. And there's DoD directives asserting First Amendment rights. The military cracks down on that, but people still have those rights. So, that's one of those things, like Sarah was saying, that as somebody with some amount of knowledge or experience or skill in certain areas, those can be really beneficial and useful to people who are in immediate need, and in immediate need in the military, for example. So that's the kind of thing, and looking at these ways in which some sort of legal knowledge and understanding military law, that's one of the things, we work primarily, my office works primarily in Section 1983 federal civil rights law, and it's very different than military law. So I've been trying to get myself caught up in the whole military legal structure, because we don't know that. And we were asking, actually, David, if there was any military law classes here at Illinois, and people, it seems like no, that there isn't anything to learn that. So it's really, and that's the thing, you get a JAG. If you're charged with a crime or whatever, you have the right to a lawyer, but the JAG system it's all one system. That's the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and the judge is all part of JAG. You have the right to a civilian attorney, but the number of civilian attorneys who know this law is extremely limited. And so any sort of legal workers, law students, lawyers can really provide a huge support by trying to understand these things and trying to have a little bit more perspective. And there's a lot that can be done there. And to touch on about, related to that is, IVAW, to answer David's question, IVAW has always been working with larger movements, and most people within IVAW recognize that these wars are connected to broader social issues. So the reason we have an intense military sexual trauma problem in the military is because we as a society have a problem with sexism. We live in a patriarchal society, and that is intensified in the military. So how to connect that to larger things? Recognizing, there's unemployment problems that are exacerbated for veterans, particularly because of some of these issues about trauma, right? It's harder to find a job, it's harder to hold down a job. So that relates to our economic crisis larger than that. So we, both IVAW and civilian supporters went to Madison last year, about this time last year, doing support work for the labor movement that was occupying the Capitol and marching through the streets of Madison, and stood in solidarity with those workers and identified that that service members are workers and have workers' rights. That's something that really needs to be framed in a more interesting way than we are considering it right now. And another thing is that when there were other summits coming up for the G8 and NATO, and they were both slated to happen in Chicago, but now just the NATO summit is happening in Chicago, and the G8 summit's moved to Camp David. But IVAW and the Civilian Soldier Alliance and other allies are working to do an action to confront the generals in NATO for sending service members to perpetual war in Afghanistan and throughout the globe. So there's an announcement, actually, maybe we should pass that around, but a call to action around the NATO summit asking for supporters to come and march behind IVAW as they ask for an apology from these generals who sent them to war and return their medals for refusing to acknowledge their human rights and the human rights of the people of Afghanistan and throughout the globe.
Yeah, just to speak to that real quick, all of our medals have been awarded during the global war on terrorism. All of us have been, as soon as 9/11 happened, they gave us all a little medal called the GWAT medal. The global war on terrorism is based on a failed policy, and it's based on lies. And we're part of that, and we don't want that. We don't want to continue to contribute to that, and I don't want medals that reflect that or about that. They give us Napoleon said, you give a man a piece of tin and he'll die for you and do anything for you. And I don't need that piece of tin. That's not who I am. That's not who makes me a human being, and that's not what gives me my human rights or my civil rights. And just also there's a historical precedent in regards to the National Guard service members and active duty service members being called out on mass mobilizations in the United States. And that was one of the specific things that we did around Madison, was we reached out to the National Guard, and we had over 1,000 people call the headquarters of the Wisconsin National Guard, asking them not to mobilize against the workers in Wisconsin. Because in the past they had actually killed workers. And there is a historical moment, and during the G20 the National Guard was called out. People know about Kent State. That's one thing that sticks out in people's minds. Well, this isn't outside of historical norm. Every time there's a mass rally, the National Guard are called out, and they don't need to be. These are citizens of the United States expressing their civil rights, their First Amendment rights. And if that can't be respected, and we have to enforce martial law because of that, I think we're headed down the wrong path. And as a service member, I look at Egypt and what's happening there, and I look at how the military stood down, and they stood with the people of Egypt, and how important that was. And I think, the question is, how does that happen here in the United States? How does the military stand with the people, not with the corporate interests that are proliferating these wars, not with the general interest or the political interests that are proliferating these wars, but with the people of this country that are suffering? We talk about bailing out the banks, and we don't acknowledge that we spent, I don't know how many times that on these wars, and how that's just a direct suck from education. I don't know how much you guys are paying for law school, but I'm sure it directly relates to that.
I just wanted to say a little bit in response to your question about some of the collaborations happening locally. I see a lot of GEO, well, okay, I see 2 GEO shirts in the room. GEO, IFT, AFT Local 6300 is a